Okay, so let's go ahead, as I said, and pick up the PowerPoint and start to walk through our discussion for tonight. So we're going to look at sources of ROIC, or return on invested capital, and growth. We're going to look at forecasting performance. Now, we're going to have to look at one other item as well. We're going to have to consider the issue of this concept of an explicit period and a continuation period. You've heard me use those terms. I think I've briefly referenced how they're applied and told you that they may be the least intuitive element we deal with in the entire course together. But we're going to try and take another stab at this. I'm going to show you this kind of graphically and talk it through before we move on, because you're going to want to have a good grasp of that before we get to next week's discussion, where we talk about valuation model structures. And so I'm actually going to give you a peek or a glimpse into a valuation model structure tonight as I give you examples of that explicit and continuation construct. Then we'll go ahead and start to look at revenue forecasts, and then we'll look at expense forecasts. We might get far enough to look at expense forecasts with adjustments. I'm sure I can get through them within 3 hours, of course. I just want to get through them while your eyes still appear to have some level of focus remaining, rather than you having gone brain dead in the interim. Because for many people, this part of the discussion can be a little bit numbing, if you will, because I'm about to ask you to think of time in a different construct than you're used to thinking about time. And that, again, that can become somewhat counterintuitive. Okay? But first, so we're going to talk through the relationships between growth and return on capital. We're going to talk about sources of growth and return on capital, those being endogenous or internal to the system, so organic, and exogenous, so influences or sources that come from outside of the system. And the system is our company and the marketplace in which our company finds itself, okay? Outside of that would be other factors, perhaps macroeconomic factors, things like a tiny little virus coming along and really ruining our day or our year or whatever it might be ruining. And then we're going to look at forecasting performance, revenue forecast, or this explicit and continuation first, revenue forecast, expense forecast, and then forecast adjustments. So let's pick up the easier part of this and talk about sources of return on capital and growth. Let's start with a recognition that if we grow the company's revenue, and if we're able to keep our expenses in line, and by that I mean assuming our expenses grow at a rate that is at least not greater than the growth of our revenue. Let me say that with some numbers. Let's assume for a moment that our revenues grow by 10%. We would hope that our expenses would grow by no more than 10%, right? We'd love our expenses to grow by less than 10%. Well, if they grow by the same 10%, we then know that that's one of the conditions for a constant returns to scale scenario. So if revenue growth and expense growth are equal to each other percentage-wise, that's one of our conditions for constant returns to scale, because that's going to give us a constant return on invested capital no matter how large our scale of our company becomes. If expenses grow faster than revenue, that would then be a decreasing return to scale condition. It's not the only condition, but it's one of the decreasing returns to scale condition. And if you think back to your macro and microeconomics courses, this would be synonymous with you having gone beyond the point at which marginal cost is equal to marginal benefit, and marginal cost is now becoming larger than marginal benefit. If we can have a scenario where our expenses grow at a slower rate than our revenues, let's assume that our expenses grew at 8% when our revenues grew at 10%, well, that would be an increasing return to scale. So that means, and the return here is our profits, right? So we all want increasing returns to scale. The fact of the matter is most of us are subject to constant returns to scale, and sometimes we find ourselves in a scenario where we actually have decreasing returns, and that's trouble. That means we've pushed the envelope too far for the capital capacity that we have. Okay, so that said, assuming we have at least constant returns to scale or increasing, then sources of growth are also sources of return on invested capital. If we have constant returns, then our ROIC will remain constant. If we have improving or increasing returns, our ROIC will grow. It will increase over time. So that said, we've got to think about organic return or organic elements. And I should have done a bit of an inset here. I apologize. Should look like this. No, that picked up more than I wanted it to. My system is not responding well tonight, and I'm terribly sorry. I don't know what's going on with it. Okay, should have looked like this. So organic or endogenous growth would come from innovation, research and development, new product introduction, and then our own internal expansion plans. So when I say innovation, what am I talking about? Some of you must be innovative.
Are you a creative idea?
Okay, so we might think about growth through getting more scale out of our company just by having more attractive products and services. Maybe it's going to be because we put together a customer loyalty program. Maybe it's because we realize that clients across the board realize that the cool shoe in the marketplace this year is orange rather than the colors we've been offering, so we add an orange shoe to our product lineup. That's not a new product, but it's a new color. So that, we can be innovating a little bit that way. Maybe it's just how we're telling our story. Maybe it's a marketing plan of some kind. So whatever we can do to eke additional revenue out of our existing product services construct without increasing price, then we think of that as organic. Now, we might also think of that if we do increase price. Is it conceivable that we can change the price of our goods without having changed our goods? Sure. So if I've been selling something to Nate at $11 and I realize that I'm 40 cents under the market, I can raise my price by 30 cents and I can still be within the market, and Nate probably will still buy from me if I'm still the low-cost producer, right? Okay, well, that kind of a price increase might lead to a increasing returns to scale if my input costs don't increase at the same time. So if all I've done is change the price to Nate for what he's buying from me, but I don't have to pay Ian anymore to help me with it, I don't have to pay Emilio or Solomon anymore as I buy things from them, then I've actually given myself an increasing return to scale. So innovation, anything we can do to better our condition that's not one of these other elements. I think research and development, that's easy. So Jason, who's the VP of our technology unit, he's responsible for our $10 million R&D budget, knows that he's going to bring some new products out of the pipe, maybe completely new products, or maybe just new innovations in existing products by having performed some research. So this is commensurate with the first bullet point and the last one as well, perhaps, or the first one and the next one rather, perhaps. But innovation, R&D, both of those are things we would invest in, so both of them better bring about some growth. Otherwise, the investment was non-productive. Just new product introduction. We know that I buy some products from Heather Page's company. And I've never bought them in the past, but I now know that our marketplace is prepared to buy those products from us as well as the products they've been buying. So I go out to Heather's distribution company and I buy a new type of widget from Heather and I sell it into our existing customer base. Well, that's going to give me expansion of my company, right? It's going to increase my revenues. So that's going to be growth. Or maybe I realize that over the last 20 years, I've been selling products. I've done so almost exclusively within the U.S. And in fact, within the western side of the United States. I have a distribution center in Salt Lake City. We service the western half of the country from the Mississippi River west. And I now have been willing to go ahead and expand by putting a distribution hub in, let's say, Virginia, West Virginia. And from there, I can pretty easily get to the entire eastern half of the country. And so I expand into a new distribution center. Or maybe I just take and expand my existing warehouse and production facility. I've been running them with a single shift each day, running from 8 o'clock in the morning until, say, 4:30 or 5 in the evening. Well, I could go ahead and expand the company's footprint, or rather, I could expand the company's revenue, expand the number of units we're selling, but not expand the footprint of my warehouse and production facility by adding a second shift. I probably don't even need to buy a new production line. I probably need more employees, right? I certainly need more input goods to have more output. But and as long as my additional wear and tear on this facility and my existing production equipment is less than what it would have cost me to put together a new environment, I've kept myself in a constant or maybe even an increasing returns to scale environment. So revenue growth, which means ROIC growth in some cases, or at least constant ROIC, but it means growth of our company, can come about by organic influences to the company itself. And these are just some examples of general areas you can think based upon the company you might considering. Maybe it's the employer you currently work for. You can think about what those specifically would be. You can also think about, okay, here I sit. I know what my operation looks like in 2019. What will it look like in 2020? Well, I think I've got some R&D that's going to pay off in the last few years. It's going to bring me an extra 3%, let's say. Or I've got an expansion plan to go into the western or eastern side of the United States, and I think I can get another 20% of revenue by doing that, by getting to the eastern customers faster than I've been able to get to them in the past, or something along those lines. You can put numbers to these organic growth activities if you know what the activity is, you and those responsible in the company with you to calculate what kind of revenue growth you're going to see. Maybe you've got some economists, maybe you've done some market research, some surveying of existing clients, whatever. And that's going to bring about some revenue and growth, some EBIT growth, some free cash flow growth organically. Any questions about that? Okay, so is organic growth free? Or is it costly?
No, it's not free.
Yeah, it's always going to cost something, right? Does it happen fast?
It can, but if you're going to expand a plan, it could take, months or even years.
In fact, you're right, King. In fact, more often than not, organic growth is going to be relatively lengthy. Our R&D pipeline takes us a while to innovate, find those new products, actually do the expansions and such. It takes time, but it tends to be relatively less expensive or inexpensive than some other type of growth mechanisms. So it's long term. It takes a long time to get going, but it's less expensive. It's not very costly. Let's contrast that with another form of growth, and that would be merger and acquisition. So I'm going to come back to Nate for a minute. He's identified that Emilio's company is a competitor of ours. It's on the Eastern Seaboard. We're mostly a Western U.S. company. It's on the Eastern Seaboard. And if we'd be willing to strike a deal with Emilio to give him $10 million for this company, he'd be happy to sell it to us. And we'd probably have to go raise that $10 million in the market somewhere. We'd have to borrow them from a bank. We probably don't have $10 million sitting around in cash unless we're the Googles or Apples of the world, right? Maybe we are going to issue some new equity capital. So go to the stock markets. We probably need to involve our investment bankers. We probably need to involve our accountants. We might need to involve regulatory authorities. We certainly need to involve attorneys in any of that. And so it's a fairly costly exercise, but the moment I own Kang's company, I own all of its cash flow immediately. So merger and acquisition, which is often the most popular form of expansion of a company, is rapid by comparison to organic growth, but it's more costly. So we have a trade-off, okay? You see companies going after M&A rather than organic growth all too often. Why is that?
Time and the ability to recognize revenue in a given period of time.
Yeah,
So like I know like in our company, like if we have an EBITDA number that we've got to hit, a pretty aggressive one within a year, one way that we hit that number is by hiring smaller numbers because we recognize that revenue instantly within that year.
And Kang, is your company publicly held, or do you have external investors?
So we're owned by a private equity.
Yep, an external investor. So anytime you're publicly held, which means the market owns you, or you have other external investors, venture capital companies, private equity companies, then they're looking for rapid expansion, right? In fact, we're having, in a private equity firm, we've got to report to our investors every quarter. In a publicly held firm, the market's reporting to all of us every moment, right? So time frames are really compact. Now, they're less compact for venture capital and private equity than they are publicly held. But if we just privately hold this, it's just the Vo and the Haskell households that own these companies, then we have the luxury of giving ourselves all kinds of time. But the market has caused us to be far more responsive, and it's caused us to compress time. And so speed is of the essence. In fact, very often we're willing to pay a premium to capture those cash flows very quickly by M&A, just because we then get the recognition from our investors in the market for having done so. And that recognition is going to be observed in expansion of value. Does that make sense? Any questions about those elements so far?
Does it help companies, in a sense, stay? Is it an easy way to stay relevant as far as M&A? I'm thinking of Facebook. You know, I think maybe sometimes he runs out of ideas or something, so he's bought and purchased a lot of companies. Is that a good way to do that? Is that maybe a reasoning behind that?
Well, Zuckerberg and his directors have certainly thought it was a good strategy, right? What they're saying is that it's less costly for them to acquire that idea and some structure that's already been put around it than it is for them to recreate it themselves or coming up with a new competing idea. That's what we're saying when we acquire some other companies out there. I could certainly say, you know, I'm not going to buy your company, Kang. I respect your company. I wish you all the luck in the world. By the way, I'm about to bury you because I'm going to charge a lower price to your customers than you're charging. And so I hope you really enjoyed all that happiness you used to have because you're about to not have it anymore. And so I can do that, but it's going to be costly for me, right? It might be less costly to come in and just strike an agreement with Kang to acquire his company. And private equity does this all the time. And in fact, it's at the heart of private equity. Okay.
Would you say M&A has increased in the past 20 or 30 years with the completely unusual interest rate situation that we've had?
Yeah, that's a good question. Who was that? Was that Emilio?
Yeah.
Yeah, Emilio, I think so. I mean, what we can certainly say is that access to capital has become cheaper, and so it's become more abundant, right? And access to capital in the private markets, so venture capital, angel investors, private equity, has become far more available. And so you see a lot more of that kind of activity, and we see less IPO activity. Those things are for certain, and those are a function of changing regulatory environment and that inexpensive access to plentiful capital. Okay.
then there's also what's interesting, and I was just thinking about this over the weekend when I was doing the homework exercises. When you raise debt to do stock buybacks, you can affect your weighted average cost of capital and make your numbers look better. To what extent do you think, especially given that rates have been held artificially low for over a decade, how much has that been going on? How much is it the stock buyback to improve your bottom line through debt or rebalancing your accounting equation? How much has that happened?
Yeah, I would say only all day, every day. So the activity that you see in the repurchase markets, not repurchase obligations as some of you know them, but repurchasing stock from the open market, may not be exclusively about adding value to the asset by virtue of decreasing its capital cost, but it is largely about that. I'd say, and this is just a guess off the top of my very little head, but I'd guess more than 80% of stock buybacks are a function of this. And part of the reason that you saw that example in the practice homework and the homework, and now we're about to talk about capital changes. This is purposeful. So stock buybacks, or anytime we're able to reduce the weight of our expensive capital components and increase the weight of our inexpensive capital components, that's going to reduce our weighted average cost of capital. And given that the discount rate, or WACC in this case, is in the denominator of our equations, it will increase the value that we might estimate. So Emilio, I think it's at the heart of almost every stock repurchase that you see. Every once in a while, you'll see a stock repurchase because the company's sitting on a grundle of cash and it's willing to spend some of that cash to buy back its own stock. And sometimes that's also because the company doesn't see any better investments out there than its own equity. I'm not sure how common that is, but sometimes the best investment I can see is my company's own equity. So I spend some of our cash and I concentrate that equity percentage-wise amongst a smaller group of investors. And I believe I can improve my return by doing that. And I might be able to decrease my cost of capital in doing it at the same time. Good question. Well, that's at the heart of this next one, capital changes. So you beat me to that punch. So macroeconomic conditions, where we're going to see some growth take place, have to do with conditions outside of our control. So an example of that is we sign a new free trade agreement with a continent or a group of countries that we've not been able to do business with before. And all of a sudden, Nate walks into my office and says, Rick, we've always wanted to go into the European Union, but couldn't because of these trade restrictions. Now there's a new trade policy with the European Union. We can expand into that part of the world now. Now, it's not, you might say, well, that's organic, and it's a little bit organic, but we were allowed to finally do it because of a macroeconomic change, a trade policy change, which is well outside of our control. Changing interest rates, completely outside of our control, will bring about growth if we then get our hands on more capital and use it efficiently. These last three elements, M&A, capital changes, and macroeconomic conditions, can be thought of as exogenous factors. But M&A might also be thought of as endogenous. It's endogenous or within our system to the extent that we're using our capital, we've used our management expertise, our creativity, et cetera, to put these together. It's exogenous in that, again, if I'm trying to acquire part of Kang's company, I'm not the one that controls whether or not he's going to allow me to do it. He's the one that controls that, or at what price he's going to allow it. So that M&A kind of crosses the bounds between endogenous and exogenous. But the other two, capital changes and macroeconomic conditions, can be exogenous. And any government regulation is exogenous. Any trade policy is exogenous. Any decision from the Federal Reserve is exogenous. Any shock that comes to our system from outside of the system, whether it's a OPEC oil embargo like we saw in the 1970s, or a terror attack like we saw in 9/11, or it's a little virus that comes to us from other countries. Those are exogenous. So growth, or maybe shrinkage, will come about from a combination of those kinds of influences. And we think about growth in terms of growth of our top line revenue. Now, you might realize that in order to grow the top line revenue, we might also have to grow our capital footprint. So let's talk about that for just a moment. If you looked at the 500 companies in the S&P 500 and the 30 in the Dow Industrials, which comprise, because there's some overlap, about 507 or 508 companies. If you looked at those companies, you'd find a remarkable relationship between the change in their invested capital, fixed assets plus net working capital, and the change in their revenues. They're almost directly correlated, which would suggest that they are at constant returns to scale. So I told you that one of the conditions for constant returns to scale had to do with expenses growing at the same rate as revenue. The other condition is for our invested capital or capital footprint growing at the same rate as revenue. When those two conditions are met, we're in a constant returns to scale environment. And you're going to find that those 507 or 508 companies are pretty much stuck in a constant returns environment. Why do you suppose that would be? Well, I'm going to suggest to you that they're already amongst the largest companies in the marketplace, right? The 500 biggest companies out there. Out of the thousands and thousands of companies out there, those are the 500 or so largest. That's how they got into those indexes, okay? So that's going to be one of them, but the bigger the company, the more likely they are to already have reached optimal returns or an optimal operating environment. And to go get a little bit bigger, they probably don't pick up much in the way of any savings on a per unit or per utility of capital basis. They're already at critical mass or optimality. That's why. So that's something all of those companies have in common. Well, it's interesting. You might argue that the small company, let's say it's Vo Enterprises, the small company can grow its sales without having to grow its capital footprint. And if I look at this with pen and paper and put some plans together, I can see that. But interestingly enough, even if I expand this to the companies in the Russell 2000, so now I go from the 500 biggest companies to the 2000, and that's gotten well below companies that are at optimal scale, we find that they're pretty much still in that same constant returns environment. It is extraordinarily difficult to increase your revenue without increasing your expenses at a similar rate or without increasing your capital footprint. Okay, so let's make the assumption now that Jason, Salman, and Emilio and I are the four key players in this company. And we now are going to sit down and do a revenue forecast for the next 3 years. Let's call it the next 5 years. Are we simply going to say, well, let's see, I'm going to put my finger in the air and see which way the wind is blowing and say we're going to get 12%? Or are we going to more rigorously assess this?
Probably more rigorous if I had to venture a guess.
Yeah, if I'm paying you, you better be rigorous because I can put my finger in the air and feel the wind all by my lonesome, right? So we're going to sit down and I say, okay, Jason, you're responsible for our product sales. Emilia, you're responsible for our service and consulting revenues. Scott, maybe you're responsible for our expansion into new markets. Tell me what our landscape looks like next year. Then what does it look like the year following that? What's it look like the year following that? So we can come up with some pretty decent projections on a year-by-year basis based upon our organic plans, our M&A plans, our capital changes, our exogenous factors, and we're going to come up with some decent growth estimations based upon all these things we know in the market that will affect our growth. So we're going to do this, and we're not going to just say, well, it's going to be this average for the next 5 years. I'm going to look at what the next year looks like. I'm going to look at what the year after that looks like as well. Maybe I know I've got some products coming out of the pipeline, my R&D pipeline next year, and that they will reach saturation or good, strong penetration in a market by the following year. And that following year, I've got another set of products coming out of that pipeline as well. Or maybe the integration between Vo Enterprises and Haskell Enterprises took a year or so to really mesh. So we're actually now finally getting some good, obvious organic growth from this. So we're going to not just say, hey, look, we're going to get 7% or 12%. We're going to look at this year over year, line by line, and be rigorous about our assessment.